who's dialing in from snowy Vermont, snowing
Yep. Snowy Vermont.
on the dot, like always by Thanksgiving weekend, right?
I drove into the campus this morning. I'm already home, but I drove in through a snowy blizzard conditions. Yeah.
That's amazing. Anne lives on a road that gets very snowy between campus and her town, which is really picturesque, and moose sometimes cross the road.
It's called
right?
Moose Alley.
Moose
Yeah.
Alley. So moose are there. Moose live there. And Anne has to watch out for moose when she drives to work.
Yep. Total 2 cars on that road over the years.
Oh, that's right. That's why. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Well, no moose here and no snow, but we're so excited to see you and your home office, which I've never actually seen. Your home.
Yeah, I didn't anticipate. I don't think I would have painted the walls orange if I'd have known I'd be on Zoom, because I feel like it makes everything orange, but who would have expected these last 2 years?
It's a great color. I lived in that color for a long time in the desert. It's lovely. I like it. It looks great. Well, let me introduce you, and then we will hand the mic over to you and listen to your amazing stories for a while. This is our last Distinguished Visiting Writers Lunchtime reading for the series at English Department, Cal State East Bay. Welcome, everybody who might be watching and tuning in later. I know some faculty members are planning to check this out as they have classes and finals going on right now. So welcome. Thanks for tuning in. We have today Anne Davila Cardinal, and her are her pronouns. She is a novelist and director of recruitment at Vermont College of Fine Arts, where we've taught together for over a decade. And she has a BA in Latino Studies, an MA in Sociology, and an MFA in Writing. And she has also worked at VCFA, we call it, where we've been teaching grad school, and it's a different interesting building. I'll show you all a picture of it later on. She helped create VCFA's winter MFA in Writing residency in Puerto Rico, which we were supposed to go together with Tomas Morin, and we had to cancel that trip, travel abroad trip, because of the hurricane. And then COVID hit and chaos has ensued, and we never got to go to Puerto Rico. But she has hosted many, many, many authors in Puerto Rico. So let's talk to her about that today too. She comes from a long line of Puerto Rican writers, including father and son poets, Virgilio and Jose Antonio Davila, and her cousin, award-winning fiction writer, Terry Davila. And a little bit about her own writing. Anne's first novel, Sister Chicas, was co-written with Jane Alberteston Coraline, and Lisa Alvarado, and was released from New American Library in 2006. Her next novel, a horror YA titled 5 Midnights, was released by Tortine, and it was a finalist for the Bram Stoker Award, amongst other amazing accomplishments, like winning the 2020 International Latino Book Award in the category of Best YA Fantasy and Adventure. Category 5 came out after this in 2020, and it's a nominee for international, it was International Book Latino Award, Latino Book Award category. And I think you have many more books coming out, it looks like, right? The magical realist mystery, The Storyteller's Death, will be released in October next year. Is that true? And I hear you just turned in a couple more manuscripts. That's amazing. Her stories have appeared in many anthologies, and she lives in Vermont. So I know Anne, just to add a little bit in from the generic bio, I know Anne from teaching in Vermont, living in Vermont, and working with someone who is deeply, deeply dedicated to her work life and her family life, her academic life, and her writing life, and somehow manages to write novels while working full time, raising an amazing son, and biking a lot. And so I'm really excited and honored to bring my friend to the series and hear about how, not only hear from her in her writing life, but about how she survives and manages and thrives as an artist. So let's welcome Anne.
Thank you. Yay. I wish I were there in that beautiful building with you guys.
I know.
Pretty cool. So freaking cold here. But I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much, Trini, for inviting me. Trini was, there are many things Trini taught me, but there's particular kernels of wisdom that I've kept with me forever that I will, at some point today talk about. But I wanted to read from two very different works. This is from Category 5, which is the sequel. It's not a sequel. It's like a companion book to Five Midnights, which was the one that came out in 19. This book, so when I was in copy edits for Five Midnights, Hurricane Maria happened on the island. And I couldn't reach my family. I didn't know whether they were alive or dead. And it was, I can only imagine what it was like on the island. But for me, not knowing what was going on, it was scary. And so when I realized that I can't do a sequel to Five Midnights without addressing it. For every Puerto Rican, no matter where they live, life is either pre-Maria or post-Maria. You can't think of the island without that influence. And so I really felt like I had to address it in a sequel. So I want to read just the opening chapter of Category 5. The characters, particularly Lupe and Javier, are from the original book. Lupe is a self-described Gringa Rican, which is what I call myself because I'm half. And Javier lives on the island. All of my books have themes of addiction because I grew up with an addict parent. And so those are things that tend to recur. I write picture books and it comes through, issues of being, having a parent die young, and then issues of living in a family with addiction. So these are themes that are going to concur in this as well. But I'm just going to read the opening, the introductory chapter. And if you're familiar with horror, you know that there tends to be, oh, what is it called, Trini? There's a term. The first chapter introduces characters that you don't necessarily see again. It sort of sets the scene. And there's a word with popular fiction, and I can't remember what it is. It'll come back to me. So this is chapter 1, Bio Bay, Vieques Island, Puerto Rico. Rigoberto sighed. Once again, the trio of Gringo college students devolved into a splashing fight, using their kayak paddles to fling arcs of glowing water at each other in the velvety dark. The miracle of bioluminescence, organisms that lit up the water like microscopic fairies, was lost on them. Not to mention, they clearly weren't taking classes in maturity at their pretentious Ivy League university. Rigo had only just finished high school, but he was about 3 decades more mature than these douchey frat boys. He glanced over the dark bay, the stars of the moonless night reflected in the black surface of the water, as if there were heavens above and below. After Hurricane Maria, the mangrove trees had been practically stripped clean. But now, 9 months later, though they weren't yet tall, they were proud, their roots digging deep beneath the salty water, holding strong. It would take a lot more than a Category 5 hurricane to destroy those trees. Not that these a-holes would appreciate the magic of the place. He breathed deep and prepared his guide voice. Gentlemen, if we could get back to the tour, so I could dump your asses downtown and head to Bananas for a cold beer and an intelligent conversation with my friends. But he left the second half of his thought unspoken. Insulting tourists didn't go over well. He tried it more than once. Yeah, cut it out, you apes, the leader, Jason, chastised the others with a smirk, even though he was the one who had started it. Rigoberto had met many versions of this kid during his various summer jobs on the island. They always came with an entourage, since, he figured, bullying was no fun alone. He glanced at his watch, 8:15, only 45 minutes more. That's all Rigo was contracted for. He could survive that long. He sat up straight and returned to tour guide mode. The tiny island of Vieques was inhabited by indigenous people, the Taínos. 1,500 years before Columbus set foot in the Caribbean. Indigenous, huh? The smallest one said, then patted his mouth and did a racist hoot, laughing. But even his Neanderthal friends seemed to recognize how offensive that was, and no one laughed with him. Actually, no, that was giving them too much credit. They just seemed to ignore everything, that one said. No one would blame me if I strangled them and left them here, seriously. He twisted in his seat to look back at the group, taking a head count without even thinking. It was something you had to do when running tours. 4, he faced forward. Wait, what? He spun his head around again and looked over the group. 1, 2, 3. That was weird. He could have sworn he saw a 4th head. A chill passed over his skin despite the warmth of the evening. This whole trip had him on edge. To top it off, that night the bay looked darker somehow. He was used to giving these tours in the pitch black since it was the best way to see the dinoflagellates light up, but there was something menacing about the dark. Another shudder ran through him and he felt something brush across the back of his neck. He just needed to finish this tour so he could go back to civilization and shake this creepy vibe. He turned around and continued in a monotone voice, since they weren't listening anyway, and they clearly weren't capable of actual learning. Then it was taken over by the Spanish, and eventually in 1941, the United States military took over 2/3 of the island, displacing residents and, some say, taking advantage of the islanders when they were struggling to recover from many tragedies. Hey, watch it, amigo. My dad was military, Jason said. Of course he was. Rigoberto gave him his best and biggest patronizing smile. So was my father, actually. What, like in the Puerto Rican army? The hairy imbecile named Steve asked. Rigo winced. No, the same military. You do understand that Puerto Ricans are US citizens, don't you? Okay, so the tone was in his voice, the tone his boss had warned him about. They're assholes, but they come from very important families, so don't give them that superior tone of yours, he had warned Rigoberto, but sometimes he just couldn't help it. Hey, I don't like your tone. Great, now Jason was channeling his boss. He bit his tongue. He had to de-escalate things. He needed this job. High school was over and it was time to save for college. His family's restaurant had closed in the spring. Winter tourism was non-existent since they hadn't had power and the palm trees looked like they'd been gnawed on. I intend no disrespect, of course. The guy grinned at him, of course. Then he went back to lazily running his paddle through the water. But Rigo knew he wouldn't get off that easily. Jason proved that by adding, you do understand that our parents could buy this island out from under you, don't you? Don't take the bait, Rigo told himself. Don't do it. He kept paddling. Jason followed with, oh, wait, we already did. And the group dissolved into uproarious laughter and a round of fist pumping. Jason, as he pushed this kayak through the glistening water, Rigoberto fantasized about hitting them all over the head with his paddle. Let's continue with the tour, shall we? Wasn't it enough that this kid, Jason's father, had helped buy a huge chunk of land out from under the locals to build a monstrosity of a hotel? Now he had to take this abuse? He clenched his teeth tight, the tension spidering up from his jaw into the sides of his skull. Why does the water glow like this again? The one named Steve asked, as if he hadn't already gone over it several times. Rigo took a deep breath. As I was saying, the overly salty water of the bay is the perfect environment for the dinoflagellates, the plankton who light up the water when it's agitated. Hey, like you, Steve, the little whiny one in the last kayak interrupted. Steve turned around. What do you mean? Dinoflatulence, get it? Steve gripped his paddle with his overly hairy hands, his knuckles whitening, and Rigo had this weird feeling things were about to get out of hand. Was Steve going to beat the kid? Was that why the dark feelings were coming from? Rigo watched him carefully with no plan to intervene. He wasn't stupid. But then a smile spread on Steve's face and he used his paddle to splash the other guy. Rigoberto took a deep breath. Lord, his thoughts were dark tonight, but as the group sprayed one another, he realized this could go on all night. Okay, why don't we paddle our way across the bay to the other side where I can show you examples of red, white, and black mangroves. They moved a few yards, the only sound the dripping of water off their wooden paddles. A rustling sound came from the greenery that ran along the shore. What was that? Steve whispered, and they all froze, their heads turning nervously, staring into the darkness. One by one, they looked into each other's eyes, and Rigo saw that they were all scared. So it wasn't just him, but he didn't hear anything unusual in the quiet night. It's probably just one of the stray dogs that roam the area, he whispered. The trio was silent for a few more minutes, listening as they looked around with big eyes. Just enjoy the quiet, Rigo thought, his heart rate slowly returning to normal. But the quiet was short-lived. Man, this is boring as shit. Jason threw his paddle down into the water and it hit with the blue glowing splash. Rigo watched it begin to float away and thought there was no way in hell he was going to chase that paddle down. Jason swayed in the kayak, holding his arms across his chest like a petulant toddler, a lot like a petulant toddler. He was certainly compensating for his fear of the moment before. He was peacocking, chest out, bravado back in place. But Rigo could see from the dart of his eyes that he was still nervous. Why do we have to stay in the boats? It's not like we can't swim. Except for Kevin, Steve added. I can too swim. So the little one's name was Kevin. Now the toddlers were arguing. Rigo wasn't paid enough to babysit spoiled rich white kids, and he really was anxious to put the bay in the van's rearview mirror. So weird, he was usually more comfortable here than in town. The edges of his voice got sharper with his impatience. You can't swim here because the organisms in the water are very sensitive. He ignored the exaggerating whispers mocking his slight accent. Ooh, very sensitive. The chemicals in your bodies, deodorant, sunblock, insect repellent, kill them. We need to protect the delicate ecological balance of the system. Jason cut him off. I see now. You're one of those liberal tree-hugging types. Want to save the planet and shit. Don't engage, the voice in Rigoberto's head warned, but he'd had enough, so he ignored it. Don't you? Don't I what? Want to save the planet? Nah, man, you can take my Hummer over my dead body, fist pumping again. Hopefully that could be arranged, Rigo said under his breath. Obviously not quietly enough. What did you say? It was said low but challenging, like a growl. But Rigo's mouth didn't seem under his control anymore. Actually, it's narcissistic, entitled attitudes like yours that got us into this. He was mid-sentence when Jason stood in his kayak trying to reach for Rigo. He stood swaying back and forth as he balanced in the narrow boat, as if surprised it was on the water. He seemed as if he was distracted by the movement and using it to forget about beating Rigo to a pulp. Oh, screw you and your dino shit. Then he raised his arms over his head and dove headfirst into the water, the blue glow surrounding him as his arms and legs scissored beneath the surface. Yeah, Rigo was about at the end of his patience. I'm going to have to insist we return to the van if this behavior continues. Great. Now he sounded like his third grade teacher, Mr. Rodriguez. He hated Mr. Rodriguez. He looked around for Jason to surface, but it was quiet, too quiet. The water calm and glass-like. Where'd Jason gone? Hey, do you guys see that? Those shapes under the water? Kevin whispered as he leaned over the side of the kayak and peered into the dark water. Rigo looked where Kevin was pointing. Did he see something too? It's probably just Jason, he said quietly, though he wasn't at all sure it was Jason. Steve chuckled nervously. You're afraid of the freaking wind blowing, Kevin. Kevin's voice was shrill. No, there's two. Look, they were around here somewhere. A pale hand reached up from beneath the surface, the water dripping from it in black rivulets like blood. Its fingers stretched and coiled and pulled the edge of Steve's kayak over, dumping the large guy into the water in a pinwheeling mass of limbs. Oh, good, maybe something will eat him, Rigo thought, until it hit him that perhaps he was in danger too. Kevin screamed in a high-pitched voice, desperately paddling to turn his boat around. See, I told you there were shapes in the water, human shapes. Rigoberto looked at the two abandoned kayaks and began to wonder how long Jason had been under. Was it too long? Was there really something else in the water? In that moment, two figures broke the surface and pulled Kevin into the water. And suddenly Rigo was sitting there alone in the middle of the bay. His heart was pounding as his kayak rocked gently from side to side. Was he next? He grabbed his paddle and without a sound placed it just above the water. He could make it to shore if he really booked it. Go get help. Just then two forms breached the surface with a huge gasp of air and Rigo screamed, then recognized Jason and Steve as they shook water off like large dogs, laughing and sputtering. Rigo was horrified. He had actually been nervous for a moment there. The splash and thunk of the kayak was followed by the cackling of the two other men as Kevin sputtered and shrieked to the surface, all three of them in the water now, probably killing the dinoflagellates with their negativity alone. Rigoberto felt heat rise beneath his face. Basta, enough. He efficiently turned the kayak around and started for the shore, the welcome silhouette of the van calling to him. For the first time that night, he felt good. He'd leave these assholes to get back to town themselves. He'd retrieve the kayaks in the morning. He'd catch shit from the Institute's director, but it would be worth it. He got out in the ankle-high water, yanked his kayak onto the sand and secured it, dripping wet, onto the trailer behind the van. He climbed into the driver's seat and smiled big as he turned the key and the engine came to life. Have a good walk back, assholes, he yelled out the driver's side window as the van headlights lit up the road, sandwiched between dense foliage. He could still hear the sounds of roughhousing coming from the water as he pulled away. The idiots hadn't even noticed he'd left. Serves them right. He fiddled with the radio and found a station playing reggaeton. He tapped the wheel along with the beat of Papi Gringo's latest hit, Tormenta. Perhaps his night could be salvaged. He was out of earshot when the screaming began. So that's the opening chapter of category 5.
Spooky.
The themes of anti-colonialism come into my work a lot too, as you can see in that piece. And in fact, you will see it the next one. And so should I go to the next piece?
Yeah, keep reading.
Okay.
Let's do some more. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm writing a bunch of notes and we'll see where it goes.
Okay.
And pull a little. Oh, and I'm letting more people in as we go too.
Okay, great.
Our audience is growing.
This is from my book, The Storyteller's Death, that comes out in October of next year. And this is an adult, it's a little different. It's an adult magical realist novel based in Puerto Rico. And I actually wrote this at Vermont College of Fine Arts when I was an MFA student, when Trini and I were there together. And this was my creative thesis. You know, you do a creative thesis, a portion of a novel or poetry or whatever that you spit and polish. And the interesting thing is, it's 17 years, and I just sold it last year. So it's very exciting that it's going to be coming out, and to see it, you know, in reality, thank you, to see it like coming to fruition is very exciting. But I'm going to read the first chapter and then a little bit from chapter 4. Again, this is The Storyteller's Death, and this chapter 1 is called Death in a Back Room. There was always some old woman dying in the back room when I was a child. These women were just an expected part of the decor, like a lamp or a coffee table. I didn't know who most of them were, one ancient relative or another, and each summer I would usually find a new inhabitant. What I've come to understand in the twilight of my own life is that they were a nameless introduction to what would be my long and intimate relationship with death. They were also a doorway to a true understanding of my Puerto Rican family and the gifts and curses that came with them. I was 8 years old in the summer of 1970 when I first encountered one of the inhabitants of the back room. That particular day, my cousins and I were running through Tio Ramon's one-story concrete house at top speed, sliding over slick tiled floors as adult reprimands in rapid-fired Spanish trailed behind us like a kite tail. We had to pass through the last room, a bedroom, before breaking free of the building and barreling into the back courtyard, scattering chickens and dust in every direction. I remembered I stopped short of the threshold, staring at the unexpected body on the shadowed bed. My cousins collided into me from behind, and seeing my apprehension, said in English, "Don't worry about her, prima," as they pushed around me and pulled at my arms, coaxing me to follow them. "She can't hear you, vamos." I wanted to follow them, to be so unafraid as to walk through life as if there weren't something horrible waiting for me, just out of sight. The smell hit me first, medicinal, antiseptic, stale, like my father's hospital room back in New Jersey, that chemical odor that reached down into my stomach and squeezed. I pulled free of my cousins, my feet rooted to the door sill, their voices fading as they scampered into the daylight. I looked down at the scrubbed white Formica floor, the gray and blue dots forming moving patterns if I stared at them long enough, trying to pull me into their vortex, to get me to tip over and fall in head first. The room was spotless. Tia Lourdes always made sure of that. She had been a nurse in the war, and so the care of the infirm family members always seemed to fall to her. These days, I can't help but wonder how she felt about that, or if she was even given a choice. This was one difference I found between the Larson part of me and the Sanchez side. Even as a child, I couldn't imagine just blindly obeying someone simply because they were an adult, because they'd seen the sun rise and set more times than I had. Why did that alone impart qualifications of authority? But that attitude was not understood nor appreciated by my mother's side of the family. That summer afternoon, I stood in the doorway alone. The lights in the room were low. The bright afternoon glare permitted entry only through the wooden louvers that covered the windows, a narrow stream of sunshine spilling through the partially opened back door, still swinging from my cousin Carlos's escape. Because of the near darkness, it was at least 10 degrees cooler there than anywhere in the house. A large wooden crucifix was the only decoration on the white walls, the graphic dying figure of Jesus, a ghastly contrast to the room's sterility. I imagined the blood from the wounds on his hands and feet snaking down and among the small white peaks of the stucco walls in a race to see which would make it to the floor first. And there she was, an elderly female relative lying on a bed like an empty husk, her papery eyelids closed but quivering. A current of anxiety ran through my limbs. Or was it a thrill? The line between repulsion and fascination was blurred in that moment, but one thing was certain: I couldn't stay there forever. I decided to steal quietly but quickly through the room and not to look over at the bed. If I didn't look, it would be all right. She couldn't get me. I had made it halfway across, escaped mere feet away, when a crackly voice rose from the waxen figure under the chenille bedspread. Ay, Virgen Madre de Dios, the old woman bellowed through her toothless mouth. I jumped, picturing her bony fingers reaching for me as I tore into the backyard, temporarily blinded by the summer sun, but grateful to be free. I stopped and closed my eyes for a moment, imagining the sun was cleansing me, bleaching away the stain of dying that shivered across my skin. I avoided going through the room for the rest of that summer, not because I was afraid, but because I felt a reverence for that shrunken woman teetering on the precipice leading from this world to the next. But occasionally, I would sneak away to peer at her through the slatted window from the safety of the concrete courtyard, sweat pouring down my neck, the sun in the back of my head reminding me that I was still outside the room and far enough away that she couldn't drag me with her when she went. Okay, and now I'm going to skip to a small piece of chapter 4. Now, so what's really interesting about this is that when I sold this book, and for many years we tried to sell it, and I would revise, and then I'd put it out, and then I'd revise. But I had the character of Isla go from 8 years old to 18 when she develops this gift. And it was like, okay, horrible things happen. And then she's 18. And my editor is like, Anne, you might want to sort of dig into the time when she's with her alcoholic mother in New Jersey. And I was like, no,
Thanks.
no, I don't want to go there. And I realized she was right. And this is the thing about feedback from professors or editors, is that they make you see it in a way that you can't see it anymore, especially after you've worked on something for 16 years, And so I had to go back and no, is this my actual story word for word? No, but it is at the heart of it is my own story and the emotions from my childhood. And I came up with a concept for this scene. No one has heard this other than my editor. And so I'm very excited to be and nervous to be sharing this with you, but this is not exactly a thing that happened to me. However, I tapped into some very complicated feelings about my own childhood that you'll see. But this is from chapter 4. This is after she came back from Puerto Rico and her father had died while she was away.
Okay.
Later that week, my mother came looking for me. I was curled up, rereading Charlotte's Web in my father's butterfly chair. The smell of his cherry pipe tobacco smoke hung about me like a memory, and the worn leather was still molded to the shape of his body. What do you say we do some back to school clothes shopping? Wouldn't that be fun? My mother asked me in the forced, cheery voice that I was hearing more and more from her. I shrugged, irritated that she interrupted my reading. Why? My uniforms from last year still fit. But she pulled me up and snaked her arm through mine as if we were girlfriends going on an adventure. Well, honey, I had to take you out of St. John's, but you'll be going to Anna C. Scott in a few weeks and you'll want to look your best. I yanked my arm back and gaped at her. What? Anna C. Scott was the public elementary school where I didn't know anyone. Why? I felt like the house was shifting and tilting around me, and I put a hand on Dad's chair to steady myself. She let out a long breath and threw her arms down, the cheery facade crashing to the floor in shards. Because we can't afford St. John's anymore with just my salary, Isla. Your father's treatments ate up all of our savings. Her hazel eyes looked paler, as if the life had been drained from them. We're going to have to make sacrifices. Her voice was drained too. I stared at her, heat building in my chest. I knew it wasn't her fault, but I was still angry. I felt as though she was taking everything from me. I wanted to go back to Alma's. Why don't we ask Tia Alma for help? She thinks school is so important. I'm sure she'd pay for it. No, she barked, and I jumped, almost falling back into the chair behind me. I will not ask my family for help when you're perfectly fine going to the public school for free. She put her hands on my shoulder, but hard, like she was trying to push me down and root me into the floor instead of comfort me. We will be fine on our own, Isla. She was scaring me, so I swallowed and nodded, my eyes brimming with tears. But even then, I knew it wasn't true. We would not be fine. The first day of school came, and by the time I'd gotten dressed in my new clothes and come downstairs, Mom had already left for work. Pop-Tarts and a bag lunch sitting on the kitchen counter with a note that read, "Have a great first day," with a series of bulbous hearts drawn around it. I crumpled the paper up and threw it in the trash can. My mother was right about one thing. I had to make a good first impression. Maybe at my new school, I could start again. After all, no one would know me and I could build my own identity, make friends. I looked down at my crisp flowered dress, the tags cut off only the night before. I saw my lank, dirty blonde hair lying lifeless against my shoulders. Mom hadn't bugged me to take a shower last night, though I had expected her to, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd washed it. But there wasn't time to do it then, and I needed everything to be perfect. I ran upstairs and went into Mom's room. The spicy floral scent of Maha perfume hung in the air, and underneath something sharper, more medicine-y. I looked over at her dresser and saw the row of blank-eyed styrofoam heads that sat sentry. I started to walk toward them, but tripped on an empty bottle on the floor, kicking it across the worn wood surface. I picked it up and sniffed. That's where the sharp smell was coming from. The label had a bat on it, which was kind of cool, but I had important things to do. I put it back down on the floor and went to the dresser. The year before, when Dad was sickest, Mom had begun wearing wigs that looked just like her hair, only fluffier. "I just don't have time to dye and style it these days," she would say, as she lifted a wig and settled it over her increasingly silver-rooted hair. "This way, when I need to look put together, I can just wear these." When it was in place, the stray hairs tucked under the web cap, she would look in the mirror and smile at herself with a satisfied look. And she did look better, like she'd spent a lot of time getting ready. It was just the extra something I needed. I reached up and yanked the closest wig off, the white pitted head wobbling from the theft. I turned the wig around, pulled it over my hair, tucking my greasy locks under as I'd seen her do 1,000 times. When it was in place, I looked into the dresser mirror and smiled. It was a little big for my head, but I looked better, more grown up. When I stepped out of the house, new school bag on my shoulder, I stood taller. As I walked up our street, I noticed Mrs. Wagner staring at me, pruning shears forgotten in her hands. I waved and smiled. She never noticed me. She talked to children as if they were stray dogs she needed to shoo off her property, so it must have been my new look. It was a much longer walk down to see Scott, but it felt good to be outside, and I liked the slight crispness in the air. I started thinking about autumn, my favorite season, with its pumpkins and apple cider and Halloween. I was smiling to myself as I walked. I could almost believe that year would be different, that I would be okay. My heart was thrumming with nervousness as I made my way up the stone steps. As I went, kids started to notice me, moving to either side to let me pass. It was working. But as I started down the unfamiliar hall, the linoleum polished to a high first day of school shine, I began to hear whispers and muffled laughter that seemed to trail behind me. "Can I help you, dear?" I looked over and saw a gray-haired woman with a kind face holding a clipboard. "It's my first day," I said in a small voice, suddenly not so confident. "What's your name?" she asked. She looked at me, but then her eyes darted down to her list. "Isla Larson." I left the Sanchez off because I knew that outside of Puerto Rico, they cut off your mother's name as if it were an unnecessary appendage. "Yes, I see you right here." Her voice was a little warbly, like a cassette tape wearing thin. "You're in Miss Long's class. I'll walk you there, dear." She smiled at me, but I could tell something was wrong. I wanted to run back down the long hall out of the building and all the way home to hide until Mom got home. Instead, I held my head up straight like Alma always told me to and followed behind the woman, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking on the floor as she walked. I tried not to look at the kids as I passed by, the girls hiding their mouths with their hands like they were holding secrets back, the boys pointing. We arrived at the door to the classroom. A map of the flattened out world hung on the board at the front, rolled down like a window shade. Miss Long was standing behind her desk, and when she looked up at us, her eyes rested on me and stayed there. She came rushing over as the bell rang and the kids settled into desks with a cacophony of scraping chair legs and excited voices. She put her hand on my shoulder and smiled down at me. "Welcome, honey. You must be Isla." Before I could answer, the blue-haired lady and the Miss Long started whispering to each other over my head, but I was busy looking at a boy in the front row. He had short, spiky hair like orange-shorn grass and a spray of freckles across his nose. He was smiling at me, and I started to smile back just as he whispered one word, spitting it silently so the teachers couldn't hear. Freak. My throat tightened and I fought the urge to cry with everything I had, the rest of the noise of the classroom becoming an indiscernible hum. Miss Long bent down to talk to me, her silky hair falling on either side of her face like brown velvet curtains. Isla, let's take a walk, okay? She turned to the blue-haired lady. Mrs. Benson, can you stay with the class for a bit? The woman nodded and my teacher stood up straight and called out to the class in a voice that wasn't loud, but everyone listened to. Class, I'll be right back. Mrs. Benson is going to stay with you for a bit and I expect you to obey her. Silence fell over the class and all the students snapped into place like a row of chess pieces. Miss Long put her arm around me and walked me out of the room. I looked up at her with awe, a grown-up who made things happen, who takes care of things. As we walked down the now empty halls, she talked to me in a gentle voice. Isla, does your mother know you're wearing that wig? I shook my head and felt tears building again. Do you know why I took you out of class? I sniffled, because the kids were laughing at me. Partly. She stopped and bent down to my height, putting her face right in front of mine. But I'm more concerned about why you wore it today. I looked at her through my blurry eyes and felt it in my roiling belly that she really wanted to know, that she cared. And so it came. The tale of how my father was sick for so long, about how my mother left me in Puerto Rico, about how he died while I was gone and my mother didn't tell me, about changing schools and needing to feel put together. When I was done, I noticed tears in Miss Long's eyes too. She dropped to her knees, wrapped her arms around me, and as I began to sob, I could hear her whisper through the fibers of the wig, poor girl, poor baby, it's going to be okay. And I almost believed her. And that's that.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Thank you. It was a hard one, as you can imagine. There was a couple of those chapters.
It's so gorgeous to think about fiction. There's so much there's so much power in fiction where, as you said, if you have to go somewhere you don't want to go, fiction is a great tool. And we've talked in classes about how fiction writers are made, right? Because we get to reimagine our lives when a lot of us don't have ideal lives. Who has an ideal life anyway, though, right?
Yeah.
But fiction is a tool that a lot of us, a coping mechanism or a fun game that the brain plays. And it's such a great, relevant, never-ending world of endless variants on stories that are tough memories. So you can take a scene, like you said, rebuild it, maybe put a wig in, put a scene where you're learning, protagonist learning to go to a new school or discovering something. The facts in the plot can change, but the emotional resonance, it's there, right? How did you decide can you talk a little about those moving between plots and keeping the emotional moments in that exist deep inside you? That's a hard question, I guess, but it gets to the heart of what we all try to do in our stories, I think, a lot of the time, right?
Definitely. And plot is a complicated thing for me because when I was in the program and for a while afterward, I used to say, oh no, I'm a pantser, the whole plotter pantser, which I actually don't agree with. I don't agree in binaries. In gender, I don't agree with them in this. Mm-hmm. So it's like, I'm somewhere in between, but I was like, oh no, it's my method. And really what I was covering up was a fear of plotting. My mind doesn't work that way. I would come up with a beginning and an end, and it would be like, oh, things happen in the middle. And I thought to plot, you had to know where everything was going. And I hadn't realized that you don't really. But it took me many years, and a friend of mine, it took him 2 years to get through to me. And he said, look, you can plot. I looked at all sorts of methods, the snowflake method. Oh my God. There was the minute I saw that there was a chart and then there was a spreadsheet with it, I was like, no, my brain shut off, right? So my friend Corey McCarthy said, okay, I use a method that's particularly for speculative fiction that's based on movies. Movies I know, movies I grew up with. And so all of a sudden he puts this in front of me and I was like, oh, wait, this makes sense. And he actually broke down Harry Potter before we realized what a turf she was. But anyway, so, he broke down Harry Potter and I was like, oh, wait, I see now what it is that we're talking about. And you don't have to be a slave to it. So I started doing narrative charts based on the 3-act, whatever. And all of a sudden it now I don't know how I did it otherwise. And so the emotional moments always came for me, although there clearly were some I was avoiding, but it was more about, like you said, then making it fit into the plot and having it flow. Because the reason that book took 17 years is because I wrote it. I wrote 3 novels without just going from beginning to end. And then I would have to put structure in afterward. And it was like making a body and putting in the bones last. Yeah. Right. It's the hardest way to do it. And so I, with Corey's help, I learned to build that scaffolding. And then, and actually what I do now, particularly for speculative, because I just wrote a YA, a horror rom-com that was a blast. I can't talk about it beyond that, but yeah. And it was, but the thing is that I wrote a very spare novel first. And then with just the high points and the action and whatever. And then I put in the emotional resonance and put in the other piece. And so that's taken a long time, Trini, for me to learn. And I think that if I had somebody like you earlier on, I wouldn't have had to, no, because I probably wouldn't have listened.
No, and I would have said, don't worry about plot.
I know. And it's like,
I'm trying to learn plot.
Yeah. And I just eventually got to a point where I was like, okay, this is going to make my life easier. Mm-hmm. And it is not something I realized I didn't have to be a slave to, and I put a lot of crap in the middle to fill in those spaces, and then it grows and changes. Mm-hmm. But the emotional part, other than that 8 years I didn't want to cover, I was able to sort of, that's how writing started for me, is tapping that emotional resonance.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. We'll have so many great things to talk about in class. I'm so grateful for you sharing such a wide variety of work. Do any of you want to ask any questions before we hop over to the other link and take a little or say anything to Anne while we're here in this venue?
Oh, come on.
Come, don't be shy. Don't be shy. We have a lot of speculative writers in our group. We have a lot of multilingual authors who write Spanish and bilingual in their stories. We have, we have a great group to chat with. So we just have to get everyone talking.
Thank you, Ryder. And I want to say something to you speculative writers. Don't let the literary world, don't let their judgment of you affect your writing. It is changing. Your generation is changing things, right? But there is still this sort of, I go to AWP or writing conferences and people say, what are you working on? I write primarily horror for teens. Oh, when are you going to write a real book? And don't let them do that, because I had a colleague of Trini's who said to me, I like to open literary magazines and see how many of my friends are in there. And I said, I don't submit to literary magazines. He said, why not? I said, because I want to write for other people, not just other writers. And he was horrified, but it was like, and there's nothing wrong with literary magazines, but if what you want to do is write horror, science fiction, fantasy, do it. Because, you read N.K. Jemisin, and this is good freaking writing. And she is taking the world and breaking it up and putting it back together again. And it's like, so that's an old school thought. Like I said, your generation and millennials are changing this. Millennials and Gen Z are going to change it. But It is still, if you encounter it, don't let it discourage you from writing it.
I agree completely. And I think I'm curious to hear in this place, and maybe we can talk about it more. I honestly, as a fairy tale writer who's been like part of a literary community writing for authors and very deeply embedded in moments of horror, fantasy, abjection in my practice, like I've never understood the biases and the lines between like the old boundaries. And I'm not sure they're even worth knowing at this point because they're changing so much. So I haven't put a lot of effort into understanding those. Because for me,
That's
it's
why you
like,
and I are
there's
friends.
everybody. There's plenty of room for everybody in the world. Like
You never judge me, Trini, and your work always breaks those boundaries. It is definitely, you know, I thought it was gone. It's not. And but it is changing. I mean, look at Carmen Machado has brought horror into the literary realm, into the academic realm. I mean, her memoir is horror. And you read these amazing pieces and you think, okay, this is George Saunders has done it for years. He proved that can be literary. But if you do encounter it, just keep going.
Yeah. I have some theories we can share in class that may or may not be of use to young authors about framing it in certain ways. And especially if one is going into academic settings, building like a critical articulation around certain constructive, like, you know, criticism and thinking about how to talk about things and not justifying how one's writing, but like just being able to articulate ideas in a critical framework. Like I think those conversations people want to have in all venues, and it's fun and worthwhile learning, and one needs to know what's out there too to have conversations. So maybe we can chat about that more in a minute. We're getting some like thank yous in the side. Any other thoughts? Otherwise, let's take a little stretch and head over to the classroom link, but first clap and like unmute and say hi, and let's thank Anne for reading today and feel so lucky that we get more time with her soon. Thank you.
Definitely, thank you.
Thanks for visiting our class.
Thank you. And it was an honor to share that work with you, since this is all, you know, once you start reading from something, you get used to it. But boy, that was new. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I have a lot to say about that. That's great. Thank you so much. Okay. Let's start I'll turn the camera on so people who are coming into class can just pop in and wait, but let's take like a 10-minute stretch. Let's take a 10-minute stretch. And we'll start at 2:10.
Okay. And it's a different link. Yes.
I'll send you.
Have it.
You have it? Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'll see you all soon. I'm going to go over there now for anyone who wants to sit around and say hi before class starts.
See you in class.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.